The desert wind carried whispers of change across the dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona, in the summer of 1882. Sarah McKenna stood before Judge Harrison's imposing oak desk, her calloused hands trembling not from fear, but from the rage burning in her chest like a wildfire. The courtroom smelled of tobacco and stale whiskey, a fitting backdrop for what felt like the auction of her very soul. Before we continue with Sarah's incredible story of defiance and unexpected love, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and I'm always curious to know where our amazing listeners are tuning in from around the globe. Judge Harrison's weathered face bore the stern expression of a man who believed he held dominion over the lives of others. His gavel had sealed the fates of countless souls, but today it would meet its match in the iron will of a woman who had already lost everything she held dear. Sarah's father, Thomas McKenna, had been a respected rancher until Apache raids and a harsh winter had driven him to desperate measures. The debts he'd accumulated before his untimely death from consumption had fallen squarely on Sarah's shoulders, and the law was unforgiving to women who couldn't pay. "Miss McKenna," the judge's voice boomed across the nearly empty courtroom, "you stand before this court owing the sum of $800 to various creditors. As you have no means to satisfy these debts, and as an unmarried woman of 23 years, the law provides but one remedy." He paused, savoring the power he wielded like a fine brandy. "You will marry Mr. Jeremiah Blackwood, who has graciously agreed to assume your father's debts in exchange for your hand in marriage." Sarah's green eyes flashed with defiance as she turned to look at Jeremiah Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of death. He was wealthy, yes, but his wealth came from exploiting desperate people, and his treatment of women was whispered about in hushed tones throughout the territory. His thin lips curved into what he probably thought was a charming smile, but Sarah saw only the predatory gleam of a vulture circling wounded prey. "Your Honor," Sarah's voice cut through the stifling air like a blade, "I understand the law, but I also understand that I have the right to choose my husband from among willing suitors. I reject Mr. Blackwood's proposal." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of shock. Women simply didn't refuse such arrangements, especially when facing debtor's prison or worse. Judge Harrison's face reddened like a sunset over the desert. "Miss McKenna, you try my patience. Mr. Blackwood is the only man willing to assume such a substantial debt. Unless you can produce another suitor of equal means within the hour, you will marry him or face the consequences of your father's failures." It was then that the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open, and every head turned toward the sound. The figure that entered seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves, moving with the fluid grace of a predator who had learned to walk silently among enemies. Tall and broad-shouldered, with long black hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through the dusty windows, he wore a mixture of Apache and white man's clothing that spoke of a life lived between two worlds. The man's dark eyes swept the room with the calculating gaze of someone who had survived by reading danger in every face, every gesture. His presence filled the space like smoke from a sacred fire, and Sarah felt something stir in her chest that she couldn't quite name. This was no ordinary drifter or cowhand. This was someone who commanded respect through strength rather than fear. Someone who had earned his place in a world that wanted to erase him. "I'll take the woman's debt." His voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while Jeremiah Blackwood's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "And you are?" the judge managed to sputter, his authority suddenly feeling as fragile as morning frost. "They call me Ghost Walker," the man replied, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. "I have the means to pay her debts, and I'm willing to marry her if she'll have me." He reached into his leather vest and produced a small leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. $800, as required. Sarah stared at this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to voice. There was something in his eyes that spoke of honor, of a man who understood what it meant to fight for survival while holding on to one's soul. In that moment, she realized that her choice wasn't really between two men, but between two entirely different futures. The Apache warrior they all feared had just offered her something that Jeremiah Blackwood never could: the possibility of respect, of partnership, of a life lived on her own terms. As she looked into Ghost Walker's dark eyes, Sarah McKenna made the decision that would change everything, not just for herself, but for everyone who thought they knew what an Apache warrior and a defiant white woman were capable of, when they stood together against a world determined to break them both. The gold coins hit Judge Harrison's desk with a sound that seemed to echo through the very foundations of everything Sarah had believed about her fate. Ghost Walker's weathered hands moved with deliberate precision as he counted out the exact amount, each coin a small rebellion against the system that had tried to sell her like cattle at market. The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows that seemed to dance around this man who moved between worlds with the confidence of someone who belonged fully to neither, yet commanded both. Sarah found herself studying his face as he completed the transaction that would bind their lives together. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into desert sun and scanning horizons for danger. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of some long-ago battle that he had survived when others hadn't. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of a man who worked with weapons and horses, but also the careful, almost gentle way he handled the coins suggested someone who understood the value of precision over force. "This is highly irregular," Judge Harrison blustered, but his protest carried the hollow ring of a man who knew he was beaten. The law was the law, and Ghost Walker had met its requirements exactly. "I'll need to verify your credentials, Mr. Walker, your ability to provide for a wife, your standing in the community." Ghost Walker's laugh was low and rich, carrying undertones of genuine amusement. "Judge, I own 3,000 acres of good grazing land along the Verde River, a herd of 200 head of cattle, and enough horses to outfit a cavalry unit. My standing in the community might not meet your social standards, but my ability to provide for a wife exceeds that of most men in this territory." He gestured toward Jeremiah Blackwood, who stood frozen in rage and disbelief, including him. The truth of his words hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Everyone in the territory knew that Ghost Walker's ranch was one of the most successful operations in Arizona, built through a combination of Apache knowledge of the land and an understanding of white man's business that had confounded his enemies and earned grudging respect from his neighbors. He had survived Apache wars, cavalry raids, and the constant threat of men who would kill him simply for existing between their two worlds. Sarah stepped forward, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter morning. "Your Honor, I accept Mr. Walker's proposal." Her voice carried across the courtroom with the clarity of a church bell, and she saw something shift in Ghost Walker's expression. Not surprise, exactly, but perhaps a deepening of respect for her courage. Jeremiah Blackwood finally found his voice, and it came out as a snarl of frustrated entitlement. "This is outrageous. You can't seriously consider allowing a white woman to marry a savage. It's against the natural order, against God's will." His face had turned an alarming shade of purple, and spittle flew from his lips as he gestured wildly. "I demand you reconsider this travesty." Ghost Walker turned toward Blackwood with the slow, deliberate movement of a mountain cat preparing to strike. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of distant thunder. "Careful, Blackwood. Your words show more about your character than mine." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Sarah noticed that several of the courthouse hangers-on had quietly moved toward the exits. Judge Harrison, sensing the potential for violence, and perhaps recognizing that his authority was on shakier ground than he'd realized, hurried to complete the legal formalities. "Very well, very well. If Miss McKenna consents to the arrangement, and Mr. Walker can satisfy the debt, then I suppose that is the law requires." He fumbled with his papers, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly his carefully orchestrated plan had been derailed. As the judge mumbled through the legal requirements, Sarah found herself stealing glances at the man who would soon be her husband. There was something about the way he held himself that spoke of absolute confidence without arrogance, strength without brutality. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the territory had heard about Ghost Walker, the Apache warrior who had somehow managed to build a successful ranch while maintaining his ties to his people, who could disappear into the desert like smoke when the cavalry came looking for him, who had never been defeated in single combat, but had never killed a man who didn't try to kill him first. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, more contract than celebration. Judge Harrison's words seemed to come from very far away as Sarah repeated the vows that would bind her to this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. When Ghost Walker spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure, and Sarah felt something settle in her chest that might have been hope. When it was over, when the papers were signed and the debt officially transferred, Ghost Walker turned to her with an expression that was both serious and kind. "Mrs. Walker," he said, and the name sounded strange and wonderful in her ears. "I have a wagon waiting outside. If you're ready, I'd like to take you home." Home. The word carried weight and promise, the possibility of a place where she might belong, where she might be valued for more than her ability to satisfy someone else's debts or desires. As they walked toward the courthouse doors, Sarah felt the eyes of everyone in the room following them, some curious, some disapproving, some frankly amazed that such a thing could happen in their ordered world. Outside, the Arizona sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise new beginnings. Ghost Walker's wagon was well-built and practical, pulled by two strong horses that nickered softly at his approach. He helped her up onto the seat with a courtesy that spoke of genuine respect, and as they pulled away from the courthouse, Sarah realized that for the first time in months, She wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The wagon wheels carved steady tracks through the red dust of the Arizona desert as they left Tombstone behind, the town shrinking into a collection of weathered buildings against the vast backdrop of the Dragoon Mountains. Sarah had expected awkward silence, the uncomfortable tension of two strangers bound together by circumstance and law. Instead, she found herself oddly at peace beside this man who had rescued her from a fate worse than death without asking for anything in return, except her willingness to share his name. Ghostwalker handled the reins with the same quiet competence he had shown in the courtroom, his dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon with the practiced vigilance of someone who had learned that survival depended on seeing trouble before it saw you. The desert around them was alive with subtle movement. The dart of a roadrunner between the sagebrush, the lazy circle of a red-tailed hawk riding the thermals above the mesas, the distant dust cloud that might be wild horses, or might be something more dangerous. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels. "I know what people say about me, about my people. Some of it's true, some of it isn't. But I want you to know that you're safe with me." Sarah turned to study his profile, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his long black hair moved in the desert wind. "I'm not afraid," she said, and realized as she spoke the words that they were true. Confused, maybe. Grateful, certainly, but not afraid. She paused, gathering courage for the question that had been burning in her mind since he'd walked into that courtroom. "Why did you do it? You don't know me, don't owe me anything. Why would you take on my father's debts and marry a complete stranger?" Ghostwalker was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was choosing each one with care. "I knew your father," he said. "Thomas McKenna was one of the few white men who treated me with respect, who saw me as a man rather than a problem to be solved. When the Apache raids hit his ranch, he could have blamed my people, could have joined the voices calling for our extermination. Instead, he came to me, asked for help in recovering his stolen cattle. The wagon hit a rough patch of ground, and Ghostwalker's hands moved automatically to steady the horses. We tracked those raiders for 3 days into the Chiricahua Mountains. They weren't from my band, weren't even from any of the reservation tribes. They were renegades, outcasts who had turned to raiding because they had nowhere else to go. Your father could have shot them on sight, could have claimed the bounty the territorial government was offering for Apache scalps. Instead, he talked to them, convinced them to return his cattle in exchange for supplies and safe passage to Mexico. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to this story about her father that she had never heard. Thomas McKenna had been a good man, but she hadn't known the full extent of his goodness until this moment. "He never told me about that," she whispered. "He wouldn't have," Ghostwalker replied. "Your father understood that some acts of decency are their own reward. He also understood that in this territory, showing mercy to Apaches could get a man killed by his own neighbors." He glanced at her, and Sarah saw something in his dark eyes that might have been old pain. "When I heard about his death, about the debts he'd left behind, I made inquiries. I learned about the judge's plan to marry you off to Blackwood, and I couldn't let that happen. I owed your father a debt that couldn't be measured in gold." The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the desert floor and painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Sarah could see buildings ahead, the outline of a ranch house and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. This was Ghost Walker's home, and soon it would be hers as well. "There's something else you should know," Ghost Walker continued as they approached the ranch. "My Apache name is Nalnish, which means he works. The white men call me Ghost Walker because I can move through their world and mine without being fully seen by either. But my real name, the name my mother gave me, is Joseph. Joseph Crowfeather. I wanted you to know that before we reach home." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. This man had just given her something precious, his true name, his real identity beneath the legends and stories. "Joseph," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "I like that better than Ghost Walker." He smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "My mother would have liked you," he said. "She always said that a woman who could speak a man's true name had power over his spirit." As they pulled into the ranch yard, Sarah saw that the buildings were well-maintained and prosperous-looking. But there was something else that caught her attention: the people who emerged to greet them. There were white ranch hands and Mexican vaqueros, but also several Apache men and women who moved with the same quiet confidence as Joseph. This was clearly a place where different worlds had found a way to coexist, where the artificial boundaries that divided people elsewhere had been set aside in favor of something more practical and humane. A young Apache woman approached the wagon, her dark eyes curious but welcoming. "This is Maria," Joseph said as he helped Sarah down from the wagon. "She manages the household and keeps the rest of us from starving or freezing to death." Maria smiled and spoke a few words in Apache, which Joseph answered in the same language before turning back to Sarah. "She says you're welcome here, and that she's glad I finally found someone brave enough to marry me." His eyes twinkled with humor. "She also says that if I don't treat you well, she'll make my life very difficult." Sarah found herself laughing, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "Tell her I appreciate the support, and that I look forward to learning from her." As Joseph translated her words, Sarah realized that for the first time since her father's death, she felt like she might actually have found a place where she belonged. The ranch house itself was larger and more comfortable than she had expected, built of adobe and timber, with wide porches that would provide relief from the desert heat. As Joseph showed her through the rooms that would be her new home, Sarah began to understand that she had not just escaped a terrible fate, but had somehow stumbled into a life that might actually be worth living. The morning sun painted the adobe walls of the ranch house in warm gold as Sarah stood on the wide front porch, watching Joseph work with a young stallion in the corral. 3 weeks had passed since their wedding. 3 weeks of discovering that the man she had married was far more complex and fascinating than even the legends suggested. He moved with the horse like a dancer, speaking to the animal in low, musical tones that seemed to calm its wild spirit without breaking it. Maria appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee, the rich aroma mixing with the desert air that carried hints of sage and distant rain. "He has a gift," the Apache woman said in her careful English, her dark eyes following Joseph's movements. "The horses, they trust him because he never lies to them, never promises what he cannot give." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring the warmth against her palms. Over the past weeks, Maria had become more than a housekeeper. She had become a friend, a bridge between Sarah's old world and this new life that still felt like a dream she might wake from at any moment. "How long have you known him?" Sarah asked. "Since we were children," Maria replied. settling into one of the wooden chairs that Joseph had crafted during the long winter evenings. Our bands were allies, and our families often camped together. Even then, he was different. He could see things others could not see, understand things others could not understand. The elders said he had been touched by the spirits, that he would walk between worlds. In the corral, Joseph had succeeded in getting a halter on the stallion, and now he was simply standing beside the animal, letting it grow accustomed to his presence. Sarah had watched him work with horses before, but she never tired of seeing the patience and respect he showed to creatures that others would try to dominate through force. She was beginning to understand how he approached everything in his life. The white men fear him because they cannot control him, Maria continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone telling an old story. The Apache sometimes distrust him because he has learned to succeed in the white man's world. But those who truly know him understand that he is simply trying to build something that can survive, something that honors both sides of his heritage. A dust cloud on the horizon caught Sarah's attention, and she shaded her eyes to get a better look. 3 riders were approaching at a steady pace, and even from a distance, she could tell they weren't friendly visitors. Joseph had seen them too, and he moved away from the stallion with the fluid grace that had earned him his reputation as a warrior. "Maria," he called softly, "take Sarah inside and keep her there until I tell you it's safe." But Sarah had no intention of hiding while trouble rode toward their home. She had spent too many years being protected and sheltered, and those days were over. "I'm staying," she said firmly, moving to stand beside Joseph as he emerged from the corral. "This is my home too." Joseph's dark eyes met hers, and she saw a flash of something that might have been pride. "Very well," he said, "but stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run." The riders were close enough now for Sarah to recognize them, and her heart sank. Jeremiah Blackwood rode in the center, flanked by 2 men she didn't know, but whose gun belts and hard faces marked them as hired trouble. Blackwood's expression was a mask of cold fury, and Sarah realized that he had not accepted his defeat in the courthouse as final. "Walker!" Blackwood called out as he reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch. "I've come to discuss a business proposition with you." Joseph's hand rested casually on the grip of the Colt revolver at his hip, but his voice remained calm and level. "I can't imagine what business we might have, Blackwood. State your piece and ride on." Blackwood's thin lips curved into what he probably thought was a smile, but Sarah saw only malice and wounded pride. "It's about your wife, actually. I'm prepared to offer you $1,500 for her. That's nearly double what you paid for her debts, a tidy profit for 3 weeks' work." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the wind moving through the mesquite trees and the distant call of a coyote. When Joseph finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of a rattlesnake's warning. "My wife is not for sale, Blackwood. Not for $1,500, not for $15,000. I suggest you turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Now, Blackwood said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Let's be reasonable here. We both know this marriage is just a business arrangement. The woman needed someone to pay her debts, and you needed, well, whatever it is savages need from white women. But I can offer you something better than a temporary arrangement. I can offer you enough money to to buy yourself a dozen Apache squaws. Sarah felt rage building in her chest like a wildfire. But before she could speak, Joseph stepped forward with the deadly grace of a predator. "Blackwood," he said, his voice so quiet that the other man had to lean forward to hear him. "You have exactly 10 seconds to apologize to my wife and ride away. If you're still here after that, I'm going to kill you." The two hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles, their hands moving toward their weapons. But there was something in Joseph's stillness, in the absolute certainty of his words, that gave them pause. This was not a man making empty threats. This was a warrior stating a simple fact. Blackwood's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. "You think you can threaten me, you half-breed bastard? I have friends in the territorial government, friends in the cavalry. One word from me, and they'll burn this place to the ground and hang you from the nearest tree." "Maybe," Joseph replied, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "But you won't be alive to see it. 5 seconds, Blackwood." For a moment, Sarah thought the man might actually be foolish enough to draw his weapon. But something in Joseph's eyes, some glimpse of the warrior who had earned his fearsome reputation, finally penetrated Blackwood's arrogance. With a curse that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush, he wheeled his horse around and spurted toward the horizon, his hired guns following close behind. As the dust settled, Joseph turned to Sarah with an expression that was both apologetic and concerned. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," he said. "Blackwood is a man who can't accept that the world doesn't owe him whatever he wants." Sarah stepped closer to him, close enough to see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands were still ready for violence. "Joseph," she said softly, "thank you for defending me, for defending us. But I need you to know something." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin and the slight roughness of his beard. "This isn't just a business arrangement for me anymore. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere in these past 3 weeks, this became real." Joseph's eyes widened slightly, and Sarah saw something shift in their depths, something that looked like hope mixed with wonder. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know that it was real for me from the moment I saw you standing up to that judge. You have a strength that most men would envy, a courage that humbles me. I may have married you to honor a debt to your father, but I would marry you again tomorrow for no reason other than love." As he spoke the word love, Sarah felt something inside her chest bloom like a desert flower after rain. This man, this warrior who moved between worlds with such grace and strength, loved her. Not for her beauty, or her compliance, or her ability to bear children, but for the very qualities that had made other men want to break her spirit. Standing there on the porch of their home, with the vast Arizona desert stretching out around them and the promise of storms gathering on the horizon, Sarah McKenna Walker realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A partnership built on mutual respect, a love that honored both strength and gentleness, and a future that belonged to them alone. The autumn rains had come early to the Verde Valley. 6 months had passed since their wedding. 6 months of learning each other's rhythms and discovering that what had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into something deeper and more precious than either had dared to hope. Sarah stood in the kitchen of their adobe home, her hands busy with the evening meal, while her mind wandered to the changes that had taken place, not just in her heart, but in the very fabric of their community. Word of their marriage had spread throughout the territory, and the reactions had been as varied as the people themselves. Some, like Judge Harrison and his cronies, viewed it as an abomination against the natural order. Others, particularly the Mexican families and the few Apache who had managed to maintain their ranches, saw it as proof that different worlds could indeed coexist in harmony. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the window, and she smiled as she recognized the familiar figures of Joseph and Miguel Santos, their Mexican neighbor, whose ranch bordered theirs to the south. The two men had become close friends over the months, united by their shared understanding of what it meant to build something lasting in a land that seemed determined to tear down anything that didn't fit its narrow definitions of acceptable. "Sarah," Joseph called as he dismounted, his voice carrying the warmth that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "Miguel has news from town that you'll want to hear." She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, noting the mixture of excitement and concern in both men's expressions. Miguel Santos was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. His family had been in the territory for 3 generations, and his judgment was respected by both Mexican and Anglo settlers. "Señora Walker," Miguel said, removing his hat with the courtesy that marked him as a gentleman, despite his rough clothing. "There has been a development in Tombstone that affects you and your husband. Jeremiah Blackwood has been arrested." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. In the months since Blackwood's threatening visit to their ranch, they had heard rumors of his increasingly erratic behavior, his growing desperation as his various business ventures failed and his debts mounted. But arrest was something she hadn't expected. "What are the charges?" Joseph asked, his voice carefully neutral. Miguel's weathered face grew grim. "Fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. It seems that Senor Blackwood has been stealing from the territorial government, using his connections to skim money from Indian agency funds. But more importantly for you, he hired those 2 gunmen to kill you, Joseph, and make it look like an Apache raid." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt Joseph's hand steady her as the implications sank in. The man who had wanted to buy her like a piece of property had been willing to commit murder to get what he wanted. "How did they find out?" she managed to ask. "One of the gunmen got drunk in a saloon and started bragging about the job," Miguel explained. "Unfortunately for him, he was bragging to an undercover federal marshal who was investigating the missing Indian agency funds. When they arrested Blackwood, they found evidence of both crimes in his office." Joseph's jaw tightened with controlled anger. "So he was planning to kill me and then claim that Sarah was a widow in need of protection. The bastard probably figured he could swoop in as her savior and get what he wanted anyway." "That appears to be exactly what he was planning," Miguel confirmed. "But there's more. The federal authorities are using this case to clean house in the territorial government. Several officials who have been taking bribes or skimming funds are being arrested. Judge Harrison is among them." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction at this news. Judge Harrison had been the architect of her near enslavement to Blackwood, and the idea that his corruption was finally being exposed felt like justice long delayed. "What happens now?" she asked. "Blackwood and his associates will face federal charges," Miguel replied. "The evidence against them is overwhelming, and the government is eager to make examples of them. They'll likely spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, if they're lucky enough to avoid the gallows." As Miguel prepared to leave, he turned back to them with an expression of genuine warmth. "I wanted you both to know that what you've built here, this partnership between your peoples, it gives hope to those of us who believe that this territory can be more than just a place where different groups fight over scraps. You've shown that respect and love can bridge any divide." After Miguel had ridden away, Sarah and Joseph stood together on their porch, watching the last light of day paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. The news of Blackwood's arrest should have felt like a victory, But Sarah found herself thinking about the larger implications of what they had learned. "Joseph," she said softly, "do you think it will ever truly be safe for us? For people like us who don't fit into neat categories?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the vigilance that had kept him alive through years of conflict. "I think," he said finally, "that safety isn't something that's given to people like us. It's something we have to create for ourselves, day by day, choice by choice. What we've built here, what we represent, it threatens people who profit from keeping different groups at each other's throats." He turned to face her, and Sarah saw in his eyes the same strength that had first drawn her to him in that courthouse months ago. "But I also think that love is stronger than fear, that respect is more powerful than hatred. Every day that we succeed, every day that our ranch prospers and our marriage grows stronger, we prove that their way isn't the only way." Sarah leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I love you, Joseph Crowfeather," she whispered, "not just for saving me from Blackwood, but for showing me what it means to be truly free." "And I love you, Sarah McKenna Walker," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "for having the courage to choose love over safety, for building this life with me even when the whole world seemed determined to tear it down." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah realized that their story was far from over. There would be other challenges, other people who would try to destroy what they had built. But she also knew that whatever came, they would face it together, as partners in every sense of the word. They had created something precious and rare, a love that transcended the artificial boundaries that divided their world, a partnership that honored both strength and gentleness, and a future that belonged entirely to them. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound seemed to carry a message of hope across the vast Arizona landscape. Sarah and Joseph had found each other against impossible odds, and their love had not only survived, but flourished. As they stood together under the endless desert sky, they knew that they had won something far more valuable than any legal victory. They had won the right to love freely, to build a life on their own terms, and to prove that the human heart recognizes no boundaries except those it chooses to accept.